the ghost in the ditch took my son a mother's nightmare. The story revolves around Jack, a reckless and misguided young man who ends up stealing from an elder, Mr. Collins, under terrible circumstances. After the theft, strange and horrifying events start unfolding around Jack, suggesting that Mr. Collins' restless spirit seeks revenge for the betrayal. What begins as a common crime soon spirals into a nightmarish encounter with the supernatural as Jack's life unravels under the weight of his guilt and the terrifying presence of the Rome spirit. Jack's descent into madness, haunted by an ominous force, is chilling and relentless, culminating in a desperate attempt to evade his fate. This version amplifies the emotional tension, bringing in a strong sense of fear, paranoia, and inevitable doom as Jack realizes that no matter what he does, he cannot escape the spirit's wrath. Part 1. The Wedding Festivity. The village of Brookshire had never seen a celebration as grand as this. The usually quiet streets were now bustling with laughter, the sounds of music, and the chatter of excited guests. It was as though the entire village had turned up to witness the union of Thomas Collins, the only son of the richest family in town, and Alice, a girl whose beauty was as renowned as her humility. The Collins family had spared no expense. Every inch of the Collins estate gleamed with lights. The scent of fresh flowers filled the air, and the guests marveled at the luxurious decor. Anne sat quietly among the crowd, a faint smile on her face as she watched the ceremony unfold. Around her, people whispered about Alice's good fortune, about how marrying into such a prestigious family would surely bring her a life of comfort and ease. But while everyone else was caught up in the joy of the event, Anne's mind was elsewhere, her thoughts tangled in the deep worry that had consumed her for months. Her son Jack was missing. Well, not missing in the physical sense he was at the wedding, somewhere in the crowd, but in every other sense, Jack had been lost to her for quite some time now. He was her only child, her pride and joy, but in recent years something had gone horribly wrong. Jack had gotten mixed up with the wrong people, fallen into gambling, and had become a stranger to her. His once bright future had dimmed, and now, every time she saw him, her heart sank a little more. She scanned the sea of faces, looking for him. When she finally spotted him, standing near the back of the crowd, her stomach twisted. He was slouching, his clothes rumpled, and his face held a distant, almost haunted expression. He hadn't shaved in days, and his eyes, once so full of life, were dull and hollow. His fingers twitched nervously at his side, a telltale sign that he was on edge. Anne looked away, her chest tightening with a familiar ache. She had done everything she could to save him, to pull him back from the edge. He seemed determined to leap off, but nothing had worked. He was slipping away, and she was powerless to stop it. The crowd erupted into applause as Thomas and Alice exchanged vows, sealing their union with a kiss. The newlyweds smiled and waved, the picture of happiness. But all Anne could think about was Jack. What would become of him? Was he already too far gone? Her thoughts spiraled, her heart pounding in her chest as the weight of her worries grew heavier. People began to move towards the reception area, eager for the feast and festivities to follow. Anne stood up, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. The noise and the laughter, the clinking of glasses, it all felt too much. She needed air, space, a moment to collect herself. She glanced towards Jack once more, but he had disappeared from view. A sense of dread curled in her gut, an inexplicable feeling that something was terribly wrong. She had been living with this feeling for months now, but tonight it was stronger than ever. "I think I'll head home," she murmured to one of the women sitting next to her, forcing a smile. "I'm not feeling well," the woman frowned, her brow furrowing in concern. "Are you sure, Anne? You should stay. It's such a beautiful wedding." Anne nodded, her smile tight. "I'll be fine. It's just a headache." "Please enjoy yourself," without waiting for a response. Anne turned and made her way through the crowd, her steps quick and purposeful. She could feel her pulse racing in her temples, the air around her suddenly feeling stifling. As she reached the edge of the estate, she paused for a moment, glancing back at the brightly lit manor. It looked so inviting, so full of life and joy. But for her, it was as if a shadow hung over everything. The night air was cool against her skin as she stepped onto the darkened road leading back to her home. The sounds of the wedding faded behind her, replaced by the quiet chirping of crickets and the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The village, usually so serene, felt unnaturally quiet tonight. Anne's steps quickened, her senses heightening with every passing second. Her mind kept drifting back to Jack. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones. There was an uneasiness in the air, a strange tension that made her skin prickle. Maybe it was just her overactive imagination, but the feeling wouldn't leave her. The dirt road wound through the outskirts of the village, and as Anne walked, the faint glow of her house came into view. She let out a sigh of relief, but it was short-lived. As she neared her home, a figure moved near the door, a tall, shadowy figure standing just beyond the porch. Anne froze, her heart leaping into her throat. She blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the figure remained. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she took a cautious step forward. "Jack," she called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. It stood motionless, as though waiting for something. Anne's breath caught in her chest. She took another step, her hands shaking as she fumbled in her pocket for her house key. "Jack, is that you?" Finally, the figure moved, stepping into the dim light cast by the porch lamp. Relief flooded her when she recognized the familiar features. It was Mr. Collins, the father of the groom, Thomas. But her relief was fleeting. Mr. Collins looked wrong. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and lifeless, as though he had seen something terrible. "Mr. Collins," Anne asked, her voice faltering. "What are you doing here?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small cloth bag, holding it out to her. "I brought this for you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Anne frowned, confused. I don't understand." "Take it," he insisted, thrusting the bag towards her. Unsure of what else to do, Anne took the bag. It was heavy, filled with something she couldn't identify. "Thank you," she said, though she didn't know what she was thanking him for. Mr. Collins didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her with that strange, empty look in his eyes. After a long, uncomfortable moment, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness without another word. Anne stood on her porch, clutching the bag tightly to her chest, her mind racing. Something was very wrong. Mr. Collins had looked like a man carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders, but it was more than that. There was something unsettling, something almost unnatural about his behavior. She glanced down at the bag in her hands. What could it possibly contain? She considered opening it right there, but the eerie silence of the night made her hesitate. Shaking off the feeling of dread creeping up her spine, she unlocked the door and stepped inside, quickly shutting it behind her. The house was cold and dark, the familiar warmth she usually felt upon entering absent. Anne flipped on a light, but the glow did little to dispel the uneasy feeling that clung to her. As she set the bag down on the kitchen table, her hand shook uncontrollably. What had just happened? Why had Mr. Collins come to her house? And why had he looked so lifeless? She didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear: something terrible had happened. Part 2. Jack's return. The evening had grown darker, colder. The once lively village now seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating something terrible lurking just out of sight. Inside the small, dimly lit house, Anne sat in her worn armchair, the soft ticking of the old clock the only sound in the room. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly. Her heart had been heavy with worry for months, ever since Jack had fallen deeper into his reckless habits. Gambling, drinking, lying. It had all consumed him, transforming him from the bright, eager boy she had raised into a shadow of his former self. Where was he? Her eyes flicked to the door every few minutes, hoping, dreading that he would return. The air in the house was stifling, thick with her growing anxiety. She felt a deep unease, something far worse than the usual worry she carried. Tonight it felt different, like an invisible hand was squeezing her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She stood up, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet as she moved to the window. The night outside was pitch black, the faint glow of the village's distant lights barely reaching her home at the edge of town. She peered into the shadows, her breath fogging up the cold glass. The road was empty. Her mind raced. Where could Jack be? She knew he wasn't at the wedding anymore. She had seen him slink away earlier, his expression distant, his body language filled with a restlessness that she had come to recognize all too well. He had that look when he was up to no good. As the minutes dragged on, Anne's thoughts darkened. What if something had happened to him? She had heard rumors around the village, whispers of dangerous people who frequented the gambling dens Jack had started visiting. There were stories of violence, of debts paid with blood, and Jack HE was in over his head, far over his head. A sudden noise jolted her from her thoughts. The front door rattled violently, followed by the sound of someone fumbling with the handle. Anne's heart leapt into her throat, her breath catching as she rushed toward the door. She flung it open just as Jack stumbled inside, nearly falling over the threshold. Jack, she gasped, catching him by the arm before he could collapse onto the floor. He reeked of sweat and dirt, his clothes torn and stained with mud. His face was pale, his hair a tangled mess, and his hand shook as he wiped at his brow. There was a wildness in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before fear. Where have you been? Anne demanded, her voice trembling with both relief and anger. What's happened to you? Jack waved her off, stumbling further into the room. It's nothing, Ma. Just thought had a rough night. Don't worry about it, nothing, she echoed incredulously, her eyes wide with disbelief. Look at you. You're a mess, Jack. She stopped, her gaze falling to his hands. They were filthy, covered in a dark, sticky substance. Her stomach lurched as she wondered if it was blood. What have you done? Jack flinched at her words, his eyes darting to his hands before he quickly stuffed them into his pockets. I told you, it's nothing, he muttered, avoiding her gaze. Just got into a fight, that's all. Anne's heart pounded painfully in her chest. She didn't believe him. She couldn't. There was something more to this, something he wasn't telling her. She stepped closer, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his arm. Jack, she whispered, her voice softer now, pleading, please tell me the truth. What happened? For a moment he froze, his jaw tightening as if he were holding back a flood of words, of confessions. His eyes flicked up to meet hers, and in that instant she saw it, the guilt. It was written all over his face, in the way his eyes darted away, in the way his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight. But then, just as quickly, the wall came down. Jack pulled away from her, his face hardening, his voice turning cold. I said, it's nothing, alright? Just drop it, Ma. I'm fine. Anne stood there, her heart sinking as she watched him walk away, his steps unsteady and heavy. He disappeared down the narrow hallway, slamming the door to his room behind him. The sound echoed through the small house, leaving behind an oppressive silence that made her skin crawl. She stood in the middle of the room, her breath coming in short, shaky bursts. Something was very wrong. Jack was hiding something far worse than just another fight or another lost bet. She had seen that look in his eyes before, the way guilt ate away at him, gnawing at his conscience. But tonight was different. There was fear in his eyes, a fear that she couldn't shake from her mind. Her gaze drifted to the clock on the wall. The wedding had been over for hours now. Whatever had happened, it had happened after he left the celebration. And then suddenly she remembered Mr. Collins. The way he had shown up at her door earlier, so quiet, so unnerving, with that strange bag of food. Her skin prickled as she recalled the vacant look in his eyes, the way he had stood there, silent and distant. Why had he come? What did it mean? And why did Jack look like he had seen a ghost when he walked through the door? Anne's mind raced, her thoughts spiraling as she tried to piece together the fragments of the evening. But nothing made sense. All she had was a growing sense of dread, an awful feeling that whatever Jack had gotten himself into, it was something dark, something dangerous, and there was nothing she could do to protect him. With a shaky sigh, she walked to the kitchen table, where the small cloth bag still sat, untouched. She reached for it, her fingers brushing against the rough fabric as she lifted it to inspect the contents. Inside were a few apples, some bread, and a small portion of meat. Simple food, nothing strange or out of place. But the way it had been given to her, the way Mr. Collins had looked at her, something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. Unable to shake the feeling of unease, Anne left the bag on the table and made her way to her bedroom. She needed rest, needed to clear her mind, though she knew sleep would not come easily tonight. As she climbed into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her mind remained fixated on Jack, on the fear in his eyes, on the strange encounter with Mr. Collins, on the deep, gnawing sense that something terrible was coming. Lying in the dark, her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of the growing danger she couldn't quite put into words. She tried to close her eyes, tried to calm her racing thoughts, but it was no use. There was a storm brewing, she could feel it. And when it came, she feared it would tear everything apart. Part 3. The visit. The house was deathly silent, save for the faint ticking of the old clock in the hallway. Anne had fallen asleep with a heavy heart, her mind swirling with thoughts of Jack and the strange events of the evening. Yet, despite her exhaustion, her sleep was restless, filled with half-formed nightmares that seemed to tug at the edges of her consciousness, as though some unseen force lingered just beyond her reach. She tossed and turned, her body unable to relax, her heart unable to quiet its frantic beating. Suddenly, a sharp knock cut through the darkness. Anne shot up in bed, her breath caught in her throat. The sound had been so jarring, so sudden that for a moment she wondered if it was part of her dream. But then it came again, 3 deliberate, almost hesitant knocks, each one louder and more insistent than the last. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Anne's chest tightened with an inexplicable sense of dread. Who could be knocking at this hour? Her mind raced, trying to push away the fear rising like bile in her throat. She glanced at the clock. It was just past midnight. The wedding had long ended, and the village had fallen into its usual slumber hours ago. She slid out of bed, her feet barely making a sound as they touched the cold floor. The knocks continued, steady and deliberate, echoing through the narrow hallway like a distant warning. With each knock, her pulse quickened, her skin prickling with an uneasy anticipation. Who could it be? Was it Jack? Had something happened? 1,000 scenarios flashed through her mind, each more unsettling than the last. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she reached the front door, her hand hovering over the handle. For a moment she hesitated, her body screaming at her to turn back, to lock the door and stay inside. But something, whether curiosity or sheer instinct, urged her forward. With a trembling hand she unlocked the door and slowly pulled it open. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the pale light of the moon, was Mr. Collins. Anne's breath caught in her throat. The sight of him sent a cold shiver down her spine. His face was ghostly white, almost grey, and his clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame, as if he had been walking in the rain, though the sky had been clear all night. His hair hung limp and wet over his forehead, and his eyes, those eyes that had once been full of life, were hollow, vacant, staring right through her. For a moment they simply stood there, frozen in time. Anne's mind raced, struggling to make sense of the scene in front of her. Something was terribly, horribly wrong. Mr. Collins shouldn't be here, especially not like this. Mr. Collins, Anne's voice trembled as she spoke, her words barely more than a whisper. What? What are you doing here? He didn't answer. His lips parted slightly, as though he were about to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small cloth bag, holding it out to her with a shaking hand. His fingers were pale, almost blue, and there was something about the way they trembled that made Anne's stomach twist with unease. "I brought this for you," he said, his voice hoarse and brittle, as though the words themselves were forced out of him. There was no warmth in his tone, no kindness, just a cold, mechanical monotony that sent chills down her spine. Anne hesitated for a moment, her eyes flicking from the back to his face. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he stood there, motionless except for the slight quiver of his outstretched hand. She felt as if she was staring at a man who wasn't entirely there, as though he existed in some other realm, one that didn't quite belong to the world she knew. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely audible, as she reached out to take the bag from him. The moment her fingers brushed against the rough fabric, a sharp jolt of cold shot up her arm, so sudden and intense that she nearly dropped the bag. Mr. Collins still didn't move. He didn't blink, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. He simply stood there, staring at her with those empty, lifeless eyes, the pale glow of the moon casting an eerie shadow over his gaunt features. Anne's heart pounded in her chest, a cold sweat breaking out along her forehead. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask him what was going on, but the words died on her tongue. The oppressive silence between them seemed to stretch on forever, suffocating her with its weight. And then, without warning, Mr. Collins turned and walked away. Anne stood there, frozen, watching as he disappeared into the night, his soaked clothes dripping water onto the ground with every step. The darkness swallowed him whole, and within moments it was as though he had never been there at all. She closed the door slowly, her mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. Her fingers gripped the bag tightly, the weight of it heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. She glanced down at it, her pulse quickening as the unease gnawed at her insides. What was this? Why had he brought it to her? She thought of Jack, of the fear in his eyes when he had come home, dirty and disheveled, refusing to tell her what had happened. And now Mr. Collins. Something connected the two of them. She could feel it, an invisible thread of dread weaving through the night. Her hands trembled as she set the bag down on the kitchen table, unwilling to open it just yet. There was something about it, something that made her feel as though opening it would unravel something far worse than she could imagine. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, she retreated to her bedroom, though sleep seemed impossible now. She lay in bed, her heart racing, her mind replaying the strange encounter over and over again. Mr. Collins, his pale, wet skin, his lifeless eyes, he had looked like a man who had crawled out of a grave. Morning couldn't come soon enough. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, Anne rose from bed, her body heavy with exhaustion. She hadn't slept at all, the night filled with the oppressive weight of her thoughts. She moved through the house like a ghost, her hands shaking as she made herself a cup of tea, though the taste barely registered on her tongue. As she sat at the kitchen table, her eyes fell on the bag once more. It sat there, innocuous and ordinary, but to her it felt like a ticking bomb. She had to open it. She had to open it. She had to know. With trembling hands, she untied the knot and peered inside. It was just food, some bread, fruit, and a small portion of meat, nothing strange, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, the sight of it filled her with a deep, inexplicable sense of unease. Why had he brought this to her, in the dead of night, looking like a man who had drowned? The answer came later that morning, in the form of a thick knock at her door. When Anne opened it, she was met by Mrs. Fisher, the local baker, her face pale and stricken with horror. "Have you heard?" Mrs. Fisher gasped, her hands shaking as she clutched Anne's arm. "Mr. Collins. His dead." Anne's blood turned to ice. "What? That can't be. I saw him last night. He was here." Mrs. Fisher shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. No, Anne. They found him this morning. In the canal. He must have fallen in last night, they said. They said he's been dead for hours. Anne's mind reeled, her body numb with shock. No, it wasn't possible. She had seen him, spoken to him. He had stood in her doorway, cold and wet, just hours ago. But as the truth settled over her like a suffocating fog, she realized the horrifying reality of what she had seen. Mr. Collins hadn't just been wet, he had been dead. The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet, and Anne clutched the door frame for support, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She felt as though she were drowning, her mind spiraling into a nightmare from which she couldn't wake. What had she seen? What had come to her door last night? And, most terrifying of all, why had it come? Part 4. The haunting begins. The air in the house had become thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Every corner seemed to hum with an energy Anne couldn't quite place. Something dark, something heavy. It had been days since Mr. Collins' death, days since that eerie visit, and yet the strangeness that lingered in the wake of it hadn't subsided. If anything, it had only grown worse. But the worst of it wasn't the silence or the strange creaks in the floorboards that had begun to echo through the house late at night. No, the worst was Jack. Since that night, Jack had barely left his room. He had retreated into it like a wounded animal, locking the door behind him and refusing to come out for meals or conversation. Anne had tried to coax him out, knocking gently at first, then more insistently. But each time his response was the same, a mumbled "go away," marred through the thick wooden door, his voice tight and strained. At first, Anne had assumed it was his usual pattern, Jack sinking deeper into his troubles, avoiding her questions, pretending he could hide from the mess he had made of his life. But this time there was something different in his tone. There was something, afraid. The days wore on, and Jack's behavior grew more erratic. She would hear him pacing back and forth late into the night, his footsteps quick and agitated, his mutterings barely audible through the walls. Occasionally his voice would rise in a fevered pitch, as if he were speaking to someone arguing, pleading. Other times Anne could swear she heard him sobbing quietly, muffled as if he were trying to suppress the sound. The dread that had lodged itself in Anne's chest from the night of Mr. Collins' death tightened its grip. Something was very, very wrong. And it wasn't just Jack's usual trouble. It was something else. Something worse. One night, as she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, she heard it again, Jack, pacing and muttering, his voice barely a whisper. But this time, something in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't just the anxious, restless tone she had grown used to. It was something darker, something that made her skin prickle with unease. Please, no, I didn't mean to. His voice slid through the walls, trembling with fear. I'm sorry. Anne sat up in bed, her heart racing. She swung her legs over the side and padded down the hallway to Jack's door, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She pressed her ear to the wood, listening. There was a long paused silence, save for the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Then, suddenly, Jack's voice returned, louder this time, sharp with terror. Leave me alone. I didn't want to leave me alone. Anne's hand flew to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her pulse raced, fear twisting in her gut. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. She knocked on the door, harder this time, her voice trembling as she called out, Jack. Jack, open the door. There was no response, only silence. She knocked again, more urgently now. Jack, please, talk to me. What's going on? For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, the sound of the lock clicking. Slowly, hesitantly, the door creaked open, revealing Jack standing in the doorway, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with fear. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unwashed, and dark circles framed his hollow eyes. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Anne's heart broke at the sight of him. Jack, she whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. What's happening? Please talk to me. Jack flinched away from her touch, his body trembling as though he were on the edge of some unseen abyss. His eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something that wasn't there, and his breathing was shallow and erratic. I didn't want to, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean to. Anne frowned, her heart racing. Didn't want to what? Jack, what are you talking about? Took a shaky step back, his hands trembling as he ran them through his hair. I didn't mean to take it. I thought I could fix things. I thought it would help. Anne felt her stomach drop. She had feared this moment, dreaded it, But now, hearing it from Jack's own lips, it was worse than she had imagined. "What did you take?" she asked softly, though deep down she already knew. Jack's eyes met hers, and in them she saw a flicker of something: guilt, terror, and a darkness she couldn't quite place. "From Mr. Collins," he whispered, his voice was hoarse and strained. "I stole from him that night. I didn't mean for him to." He broke off, his words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Anne felt her breath catch in her throat, her mind reeling. You stole from him?" The nighty Jack nodded, his eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know, Ma. I swear I didn't know what would happen. I thought it was just a quick way to fix everything. I didn't mean for him to." His voice cracked, and he sank to the floor, burying his face in his hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking with the weight of his guilt. "I didn't mean for him to die." For a moment, Anne was too stunned to speak. Her mind struggled to process what Jack had just told her, the horror of it sinking into her bones like ice. She knelt down beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his shoulder. "Jack," she whispered, her voice shaking. What happened that night?" Jack looked up at her, his face pale and tear-streaked. "I saw him," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "After I took the money, I was walking back through the woods, and I saw him. He was just standing there, staring at me." Anne's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. "You saw Mr. Collins?" Jack nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "But he wasn't. He wasn't alive, Ma. He was dead. His clothes were wet, his skin was grey, and his eyes, oh God, his eyes, Ma. They were empty. Like he was looking right through me." Anne felt a cold chill run down her spine, her hands trembling as she clutched Jack's arm. "What did he do?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Jack's body shook with a sob. "He came after me," he whispered, his voice thick with terror. "He started walking towards me, slowly at first, but then faster, and I ran. I ran as fast as I could, but no matter how far I went, I could still feel him behind me, chasing me. His footsteps, they were so loud, like they were right next to me." Anne's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing. She could hardly breathe. "But, Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling, "Mr. Collins is dead, I know." Jack sobbed, his hands gripping his hair in desperation. "But he's not gone. He's here, Ma. He's haunting me." Anne's stomach twisted with dread, the weight of Jack's words pressing down on her like a lead blanket. She didn't know what to say, didn't know how to comfort him. How could she, when the truth of what he was saying clawed at the edges of her own mind, confirming the terror she had been trying to deny? "I can hear him at night," Jack continued, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I hear his footsteps outside my door, pacing back and forth. Sometimes I hear him whispering my name." Anne felt the blood drain from her face, her heart pounding painfully in her chest. "Jack, I'm not imagining it," Jack cried, his voice rising with a frantic edge. "I'm not. He's real, Ma. He's here, and he won't leave me alone. He wants revenge. He knows what I did." Tears filled Anne's eyes as she looked at her son, broken and terrified. She wanted to tell him it wasn't real, that it was all in his head, but she couldn't. Deep down, she knew there was more to this than just Jack's guilt. She had felt it too. The cold presence in the house, the strange sense of unease that had settled over everything since Mr. Collins' death. And now with Jack's confession, it all began to make sense. But the truth was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. Jack buried his face in his hands, his body trembling with fear. "He's going to kill me," Ma, he whispered, his voice thick with dread. "I know he is. He's waiting for the right moment." Anne's heart shattered as she wrapped her arms around her son, holding him as tightly as she could, as if somehow her embrace could protect him from the horrors that awaited. But deep down she knew that whatever was coming, whatever had been set in motion that night, was far beyond her control. And the haunting had only just begun. Part 5. Desperate Measures. The days blurred into a haze of dread and unease. The house no longer felt like the sanctuary it once was. It had become a prison of fear, where every shadow held the threat of something unseen. The walls seemed to close in around Anne and Jack, suffocating them with an oppressive heaviness that made it hard to breathe. The once familiar sounds of creaking floorboards and the rustling of wind outside now took on an eerie, sinister tone, as though the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. Jack had grown worse. His once sporadic mutterings had turned into frantic, fevered ramblings. He rarely left his room, and when he did, it was only to stumble down the hallway like a man haunted by unseen horrors. His eyes were sunken, ringed with dark circles, and his skin had taken on a pallor that made him look like a ghost of himself. The nightmares had become unbearable, not just for him but for Anne as well. She could hear him screaming in the dead of night, shouting for help, begging for mercy. It was as if something was tormenting him, something she couldn't see or touch, but could feel in every fiber of her being. Anne had never been one to believe in ghosts or spirits, but now, faced with the undeniable terror of what was happening to her son, she was forced to confront the possibility that there were forces at play beyond her understanding. The house felt cursed, poisoned by the events of that fateful night, and no matter how hard she tried to shake the feeling, she knew deep down that Jack's confession had unleashed something dark, something vengeful. It was Mr. Collins. It had to be. Desperation gnawed at Anne's mind. She had to do something, anything, to save her son from whatever was tormenting him. She couldn't stand by and watch him unravel, consumed by a guilt that seemed to manifest in ways far beyond the realm of reason. And so, despite her skepticism, despite the part of her that wanted to believe this was all in Jack's head, she sought help from the one person in the village who might understand the inexplicable: the local shaman. The woman lived on the outskirts of the village, in a small ramshackle house nestled among gnarled trees. Anne had always thought the place looked foreboding, but now, as she stood at the front door, she felt an odd sense of hope that this woman, with her strange rituals and ancient knowledge, could somehow banish the darkness that had taken hold of her home. The door creaked open slowly, revealing the shaman, a small, wizened woman with piercing eyes that seemed to see straight through Anne. She didn't say a word, merely gestured for Anne to enter, as though she had been expecting her. The inside of the house smelled of burning herbs and candle wax, the air thick with the scent of sage and incense. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of dried plants and strange talismans, and the room was dimly lit by flickering candles. The atmosphere was oppressive, but Anne forced herself to remain calm, her heart pounding in her chest as the shaman motioned for her to sit. "You seek help for the restless spirit," the shaman said, her voice low and gravelly, as though the words themselves carried weight. Anne swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's my son. He's being haunted by Mr. Collins. We don't know what to do." The shaman's eyes narrowed, her gaze sharp and unblinking. "A debt has been incurred," she said, her tone heavy with meaning. "And the dead do not rest when their grievances go unanswered." Anne's stomach twisted, the weight of guilt pressing down on her chest. "Is there anything we can do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Can we make it stop?" The shaman was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on Anne's face, as though she was searching for something unspoken. Finally she nodded slowly. "There are ways to appease the dead," she said, "but it will not be easy. The spirit is angry, vengeful. It will not be satisfied with simple apologies." Anne's heart sank, but she forced herself to remain focused. "What do we need to do?" she asked, desperation lacing her words. The shaman stood and moved to a nearby shelf, retrieving a small bundle of herbs and a handful of strange talismans, small, intricately carved symbols made of wood and bone. She placed them on the table in front of Anne, her movements slow and deliberate. "These are protective talismans," she explained, her voice steady. "Place them around your home, especially near doors and windows. They will ward off the spirit, prevent it from entering your son's room." Anne nodded, her hands trembling as she reached for the talismans. She had never believed in such things, but now, faced with the horrors that had invaded her life, She clung to the hope that they might somehow offer protection. But that is not enough, the shaman continued, her gaze dark and serious. You must also burn offerings, herbs, incense, and food to appease the spirit. The dead are drawn to the scent of the living. You must offer it something in return for peace. Anne felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What kind of offerings? The shaman's eyes bore into her. Anything that carries meaning. Bread, fruit, herbs, and when you burn them, speak the name of the dead. Ask for forgiveness. Only then may the spirit be satisfied. Anne's mind raced. Her thoughts a tangled mess of fear and desperation. She nodded, taking the herbs and talismans, her hands shaking as she clutched them to her chest. Thank you, she whispered, her voice trembling. The shaman's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as though she could see the fear that gripped Anne's heart. Be careful, she warned, her voice low. The dead are not easily appeased. If the spirit is not satisfied, the haunting will only worsen. Anne left the shaman's house with a growing sense of unease. The talismans felt heavy in her hands, their weight a constant reminder of the danger that lurked within her home. As she walked back toward the village, the sky darkened with the promise of rain, and the air grew colder, the wind biting at her skin. By the time she reached the house, it felt as though a storm had settled over her life, an invisible storm that churned and twisted, threatening to tear everything apart. She wasted no time. She placed the talismans as the shaman had instructed, hanging them above the doors and windows, hoping they would offer some semblance of protection. She lit the herbs, the smoke curling through the air, thick and pungent, filling the house with a scent that was both comforting and unsettling. And then she began to burn the offerings. As she watched the flames consume the bread and fruit, she whispered Mr. Collins' name, her voice trembling with fear. Please, she whispered, forgive us. Leave my son in peace. But even as she spoke the words, she could feel it, something dark, something angry, pressing in around her. The house groaned under the weight of it, and the air seemed to grow colder, the fire flickering as though it was struggling to stay alive. That night the noises began. It started with the creaking of the floorboards, an odd sound, slow and deliberate, like the heavy tread of footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Anne lay in bed, her heart pounding, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts as she listened to the sound. It moved through the house, room by room, growing louder and more insistent until it reached Jack's door. Then, the knocking began. 3 sharp knocks, so loud and sudden that Anne jumped out of bed, her body shaking with fear. She ran to Jack's room, but when she reached the door, it was already open. Jack stood in the doorway, his face pale and drenched in sweat, his eyes wide with terror. It's him, Jack whispered, his voice trembling. He's here. Anne's heart raced, the words of the shaman echoing in her mind. The dead do not rest when their grievances go unanswered. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and growing terror. No matter how many offerings Anne burned, no matter how many prayers she whispered, the haunting only grew worse. The noises became more frequent, more menacing. Jack's nightmares worsened, his screams piercing the silence of the night, waking Anne with a jolt of fear that never seemed to fade. At times it felt as though the very house itself had turned against them, the walls groaning under the weight of an unseen force, the air thick with a sense of malevolence that made it hard to breathe. Shadows moved where there should have been none, and the once familiar corners of the house now seemed to harbor something dark, something dangerous. Anne had done everything the shaman had instructed, but it hadn't worked. The spirit was still there, still angry, still haunting Jack with a relentless fury that left him trembling and broken. And now, as the noises grew louder and the shadows longer, Anne began to fear that the haunting would never end. Mr. Collins' spirit would not rest, not until it had claimed what it was owed, not until it had claimed Jack. Part 6. Jack's Breakdown. The house had become a nightmare, a place where the walls seemed to close in tighter with each passing day. The air, once filled with the warmth of family life, had turned cold and heavy, like the weight of something dreadful pressing down on every breath Anne took. But no matter how suffocating the atmosphere became, it was Jack's screams that truly haunted her. They came at all hours of the day and night, ripping through the silence like the wails of a tortured soul. Jack had always been strong, even in the face of his struggles, but now he was a broken shadow of the man he used to be. His body, once tall and proud, was hunched over, shivering with fear. His eyes, which had once sparkled with life, were now hollow, rimmed with dark circles, the light in them extinguished by terror. Anne could hardly bear to look at him. The guilt gnawed at her like a disease, slowly eating away at her spirit. She had done everything she could to protect him, followed every ritual, burned every offering, but it wasn't enough. Nothing seemed to stop the relentless presence of Mr. Collins. The spirit clung to Jack like a dark shadow, always lurking, always watching. Every time Anne caught a glimpse of her son, he was muttering to himself, his voice low and desperate, as though he were arguing with someone only he could see. His fingers constantly twitched, and he refused to meet her gaze, instead staring off into the distance as if some unseen horror was waiting just beyond the edges of the room. At night, things were even worse. The first time Jack had seen Mr. Collins' ghost again, he had woken Anne with a scream so loud it sent her flying out of bed. She rushed to his room, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the door handle. When she burst inside, Jack was curled up in the corner, his back pressed against the wall, his face white with terror. "He's here," Jack had cried, his voice trembling. "He's here, Ma. He's here, Ma. He's standing right there." Anne's eyes darted around the room, but there was nothing. No ghost, no shadow, no sign of anyone but Jack. Her heart raced, a mix of fear and helplessness coursing through her veins as she rushed to his side, trying to soothe him. But no matter how much she whispered reassurances, no matter how tightly she held him, Jack continued to shake, his eyes wide with horror fixed on something just behind her. "Please," he whimpered, his voice small and broken. "Please tell him to leave me alone. I didn't mean to take it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Anne's chest tightened, a knot of dread coiling in her stomach. "Jack," she whispered, stroking his hair. "There's no one here. It's just us. It's just a bad dream." But Jack shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. No, you don't understand," he cried, his voice cracking. "He's right there. He's watching me." The terror in his eyes was so raw, so overwhelming, that Anne could feel it clawing at her own mind, threatening to drag her into the madness with him. She knew he believed what he was saying, and that made it all the more terrifying. From that moment on, Jack's mental state deteriorated rapidly. His days were spent in a half-conscious daze, pacing the house, muttering to himself in a language of fear and guilt. His nights were a cacophony of screams, each one more desperate than the last. The once strong, stubborn son she had raised was unraveling before her eyes, crumbling under the weight of the haunting. Every night, the same horror repeated itself. Jack would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, his body shaking uncontrollably. His words would spill out in a frantic, jumbled mess, his hands flailing as though he were trying to push something away, something that only he could see. And every night, Anne would hold him, her heart breaking a little more as she listened to his pleas. "He's coming for me," Ma, Jack would whisper, his voice trembling. "I see him standing in the corner, just waiting. He wants to take me with him. He's not going to stop." Anne tried to reason with him, tried to tell him that it was just his guilt playing tricks on his mind. But deep down, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. The house itself had changed. It was darker now, colder, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. Shadows seemed to stretch longer, move quicker, and the creaks in the floorboards were no longer just the sounds of an old house settling. They were footsteps, slow and deliberate, as though someone or something was walking the halls at night. But it was Jack's face that haunted Anne the most. His once youthful features had grown gaunt and hollow, his skin ashen, as though the life was being drained from him, bit by bit. His eyes, once bright and full of mischief, were now wide and bloodshot, constantly darting around the room, as if expecting something to leap out of the shadows. "It's him," Jack whispered one night, his voice barely audible. "He's watching me. waiting for me to slip up. He's waiting for me to break Jack. Please, Anne begged, tears streaming down her face. You're just scared. It's not real. We can get through this, but Jack's eyes never left the corner of the room. His body trembled as he wrapped his arms around himself, rocking back and forth like a terrified child. It is real, Mahi said, his voice cracking with fear. I can feel him. I can feel him getting closer. As the days dragged on, Jack stopped leaving his room altogether. He barely ate, barely slept, and when he did, his sleep was filled with restless tossing and turning, punctuated by the occasional blood-curdling scream that would jolt Anne awake in the middle of the night. She tried everything, pleading with him, coaxing him, even attempting to get him to leave the house, but nothing worked. Jack was slipping away from her, sinking deeper into the darkness that had taken hold of his mind. And there was nothing Anne could do to stop it. One evening, as the sun began to set and cast long, eerie shadows across the house, Jack finally broke. Anne had been in the kitchen, trying to prepare dinner, though her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the knife. The silence in the house was oppressive, weighing heavily on her chest. She hadn't heard Jack in hours. No pacing, no muttering, just an unsettling quiet that made her skin crawl. She set the knife down, wiping her trembling hands on a towel, and made her way to Jack's room, her heart pounding in her chest. The door was slightly ajar, and she could hear him inside, his voice low and trembling. When she pushed the door open, her breath caught in her throat. Jack was standing in front of the mirror, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes wide with terror. His reflection stared back at him, but there was something wrong, something off. The image in the mirror seemed darker, more sinister, as though it wasn't quite Jack looking back at him. He was shaking, his hands gripping the edge of the dresser so tightly his knuckles had turned white. His eyes were locked on the mirror, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I can't do this anymore, Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. I can't live like this. Anne rushed to his side, her heart racing with fear. Jack, please, you're scaring me, she said, her voice trembling. You need to calm down, but Jack shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. He's here, he sobbed, his voice raw and broken. He's in the mirror. He's waiting for me. He wants to take me with him. Anne's blood turned to ice. She glanced at the mirror, but all she saw was their reflections, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air around them seemed to thrum with energy, cold and oppressive, as though the very walls of the house were closing in on them. He's not going to stop until he gets me, Jack whispered, his voice trembling. I deserve this. I took his money. I killed him. No, Anne cried, grabbing him by the shoulders, forcing him to look at her. You didn't kill him, Jack. It was an accident. You made a mistake, but it wasn't your fault. But Jack's eyes were distant, unfocused, as though he couldn't hear her. He's never going to leave me alone, he muttered, his voice hollow. I can't escape him. No matter what I do, he'll always be there. Suddenly, Jack wrenched free from her grip, backing away toward the wall, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I can't take it anymore, he whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. I can't live like this. Before Anne could stop him, Jack sank to the floor, his body trembling with sobs. He buried his face in his hands, rocking back and forth, his voice breaking with each word. I'm sorry, he cried. I'm so sorry. Anne fell to her knees beside him, tears streaming down her face as she put him into her arms. He was shaking uncontrollably, his body racked with fear and guilt, and all she could do was hold him as his sobs filled the room. The guilt that had consumed Jack had finally broken him, and as Anne held him, her heart shattered in her chest, she realized that no matter what she did, no matter how hard she tried, she could never save him from the darkness that had claimed his soul. The haunting was far from over. It had only just begun. Part 7. The Tragedy. The night the tragedy unfolded, the air was thick with an almost unbearable tension. The entire house seemed to tremble under the weight of something sinister, as though the walls themselves were suffocating beneath a presence unseen but deeply felt. It was quiet, too quiet, The kind of silence that wasn't simply the absence of sound but an unnatural stillness, as if even the wind outside had stopped, afraid to disturb what was about to happen. Anne could feel it in her bones. Something was wrong. She had felt the dread building up for days, creeping over her like a shadow, slowly consuming every inch of her mind. She hadn't seen Jack all day. He hadn't come out of his room, not even to eat. That in itself was enough to send her into a panic, given how erratic and broken he had been for weeks now. Every night had been the same, the screaming, the wild, haunted eyes, the frantic whispers of terror that clung to him like a second skin. But today there had been nothing, no sound, no movement, just a terrifying, oppressive silence. Anne stood at the base of the staircase, her heart pounding against her chest as she called out his name. Jack. The sound of her voice echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls, but there was no reply. The unease grew, clawing at her insides. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself as she took a hesitant step up the stairs. Jack, she called again, her voice trembling. Still nothing. She quickened her pace, her footsteps heavy on the wooden stairs as she climbed toward his room. 1,000 thoughts raced through her mind, each one more horrifying than the last. What if something had happened? What if he was hurt? What if the nightmares, the ghost of Mr. Collins, had finally driven him to the brink of madness? When she reached his door, her heart stopped. It was ajar, just a sliver of darkness visible through the crack. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob as the dread twisted in her stomach. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though something was pressing down on her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking ominously as the room came into view. Empty. Jack's bed was unmade, the blankets tossed to the side, but there was no sign of him. Anne's pulse quickened. The bathroom door, just to the left, was closed, a thin line of light seeping from underneath it. Her throat tightened. She took a step toward it, then another. Her hand trembled as she reached for the doorknob. She could hear the faint sound of water dripping, a slow, steady tap that echoed unnervingly in the silence. With a deep breath, she twisted the knob and pushed the door open. What she saw made her scream. Jack was lying on the bathroom floor, his body slumped against the side of the tub. The white tiles beneath him were stained red, the blood spreading in a dark, sickening pool around him. His wrists, oh God, his wrists were slashed, the deep cuts oozing a crimson river. The sight was so horrifying that for a moment, Anne couldn't move, couldn't think. Her mind went blank, her heart frozen in her chest. Jack, she screamed, rushing to his side. His skin was cold, clammy, and far too pale. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful in a way that sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She grabbed him, shaking him frantically, her hands slippery with his blood. Jack, no, please, no, her voice cracked, her words barely coherent as she screamed his name over and over again, begging him to wake up, to move, to breathe. But there was nothing. His body was limp, lifeless, and the stillness of it sent a cold shock of realization through her. No, 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 Anne sobbed, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she tried to stop the bleeding, pressing her palms against the wounds. The blood soaked through her fingers, warm and sticky, but she didn't care. All she cared about was saving her son. Stay with me, Jack. Please, she cried, her voice breaking. You can't leave me. You can't, she fumbled for her phone, her hand slippery and shaking so violently she almost dropped it. Through her tears, she dialed 911, choking out the words to the dispatcher, barely able to speak. He's dying, she screamed. Please send help. He's dying. The moments between the call and the ambulance's arrival felt like an eternity. Anne knelt by Jack's side, her tears mixing with the blood on the floor, whispering his name over and over again, praying for him to open his eyes. But deep down she knew that the darkness had claimed him. When the paramedics burst into the bathroom, they quickly pulled her away from Jack's body, their voices a blur in her ears as they worked to stop the bleeding. But Anne didn't hear them. All she could see was the pale, lifeless face of her son, The boy she had raised, the boy she had fought so hard to protect. And now he was slipping away from her, no matter how desperately she clung to him. They rushed him to the hospital, the sirens blaring through the night, but Anne knew, even as she sat in the back of the ambulance, that it was too late. Something deep within her told her that Jack wasn't coming back, not really. When they arrived at the hospital, the doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize him. Anne was left standing in the cold, sterile hallway, her hands stained with Jack's blood, her mind a swirling vortex of grief and fear. She could hear the voices around her, the beeping of machines, the hurried footsteps of nurses, but none of it registered. All she could think about was Jack lying on that bathroom floor, so pale, so still. Time seemed to blur. Minutes stretched into hours, and Anne found herself sitting in a chair outside the ICU, her body numb with shock. She stared blankly at the floor, her hands still trembling. Finally, a doctor approached her. His face was grim, his expression one of quiet sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the hum of the hospital. "We've managed to stop the bleeding, but your son has suffered severe oxygen deprivation. He's in a vegetative state." The words hit Anne like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She stared at the doctor, her mind struggling to comprehend what he was saying. "Vegetative state," she repeated, her voice hollow, as though the words had no meaning. The doctor nodded, his eyes full of pity. "It's unlikely he will ever regain consciousness." Anne's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed into the chair, her hands flying to her mouth as a sob tore from her throat. The world around her seemed to shatter, crumbling into 1,000 jagged pieces. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. All she could feel was the overwhelming weight of despair crushing her from the inside. She had failed. The darkness had won. Her Jack was gone. The doctor spoke in hushed tones around her, explaining the procedures they would follow, the care Jack would need. But Anne couldn't focus. Their words were muffled, distant, like the buzzing of flies around her ears. Her son was gone, trapped in a body that could no longer move, no longer speak, no longer laugh. She sat by his bedside for hours, staring at his motionless form, his chest rising and falling in shallow, mechanical breaths. His face was so still, so serene, and it tore at her heart in ways she couldn't put into words. The machines beeped softly, the only sign that life still clung to him, but it wasn't life, not really. Jack was gone. His soul had been taken, claimed by the relentless spirit of Mr. Collins. And Anne knew, deep down, that the tragedy wasn't just that Jack had tried to take his own life. The true tragedy was that the haunting had claimed him long before that. It had consumed him, broken him, until there was nothing left but fear and guilt. The ghost of Mr. Collins had taken her son. In the days that followed, Anne's grief was a living thing. It wrapped itself around her, squeezing the air from her lungs, leaving her gasping for breath in the quiet hours of the night. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All she could do was sit by Jack's side, watching him as though, if she stared long enough, he might wake up. But he never did. His body remained still, his eyes closed, his soul trapped somewhere far beyond her reach. She whispered to him sometimes, in the dead of night, when the weight of her sorrow became too much to bear. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she would say, her voice trembling with emotion. "I should have protected you. I should have more." But no matter how many times he said the words, no matter how many tears he cried, nothing changed. The tragedy had already happened. Jack was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. Part 8. Seeking Redemption. The cemetery was bathed in an eerie half-light as Anne stepped through the iron gates. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravestones. A cold wind whispered through the ancient trees, rustling the leaves like faint, ghostly murmurs. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the very ground beneath her feet resisted her presence, warning her to turn back. But Anne couldn't. She was here for Jack, here to plead for his life or whatever remained of it. She had failed to protect him from the supernatural revenge that had claimed his soul, and now, driven by desperation and grief, she sought out the one person who might offer salvation, Mr. Collins, or rather what remained of him. The graveyard was a maze of weathered tombstones, each etched with names long forgotten by the living. But Anne's destination was clear. In the distance, silhouetted against the darkening sky, stood Mr. Collins' grave, a cold, silent monument to the man who had died under such mysterious circumstances. His name was carved deep into the granite, a reminder of the life that had been taken too soon. She reached the grave, her breath shallow and uneven. The earth felt colder here, the air thicker, as if the spirit of the man buried beneath the soil still lingered, waiting. With trembling hands, Anne sank to her knees, her legs buckling beneath the weight of her grief. She clutched the cold stone of the headstone, her fingers tracing the letters of Mr. Collins' name as tears welled in her eyes. The air around her seemed to still, as though the very world held its breath, waiting for her to speak. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Please, Mr. Collins, if you can hear me, I beg you." Let Jack go. Her words hung in the air, swallowed by the silence of the graveyard. There was no answer. No gust of wind, no rustling of the trees, not even the sound of a distant bird. Just silence, endless and suffocating. Anne's heart ached with the weight of her failure. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against the cold stone as a sob racked her body. "It's my fault," she cried, her voice cracking with despair. "I should have stopped him. I should have made things right sooner. But please, Mr. Collins, I'm begging you, take me instead. Punish me for what Jack did, but leave my son alone." Still, there was no response, only the hollow echo of her voice fading into the night. Anne's fingers tightened around the stone, her knuckles white with strain. "I'll return the money," she promised, her voice hoarse. "Every last cent that Jack took from you. I'll sell everything I have if I have to. Just let him be free." He suffered enough. Tears streamed down her face as she waited for something, anything, to acknowledge her plea. But the graveyard remained silent, unmoved by her desperation. She was alone, kneeling before the grave of a man who had every reason to hate her son. A shiver ran down her spine as a cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening as the night deepened. For a moment she thought she felt something, an unseen presence, watching her from the darkness, judging her. Her heart raced, and she held her breath, waiting for some sign that her prayers had been heard. But there was nothing. No spectral voice, no flicker of light, no whisper from beyond the grave. Nothing but the relentless silence. Anne's chest tightened as despair clawed at her insides. She had come here hoping for redemption, hoping that somehow, by appealing to Mr. Collins' spirit, she could save Jack. But now, as she knelt by the grave, the weight of reality pressed down on her. There would be no forgiveness, no release from the torment that had claimed her son. The dead did not grant mercy. The wind howled through the trees, the sound a mournful wail that seemed to echo her own sorrow. She clutched the headstone tighter, her tears falling onto the cold earth below. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry," but deep down she knew that her words were futile. Mr. Collins had been wronged, stolen from, betrayed by someone he had trusted. And in death his spirit had sought justice. There would be no peace for Jack, not while the ghost of Mr. Collins lingered in this world, driven by a thirst for vengeance that could not be sated by mere apologies. The weight of that realization crushed Anne's heart. She had failed. She had failed to protect Jack when he needed her most, and now he was lost, trapped in a living death, his body nothing more than an empty shell. "I'll return the money," she whispered again, though she knew it would not be enough. "I swear." She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and stared down at the grave. The wind whipped through her hair, sending a chill down her spine as she wiped the tears from her cheeks. "Please, Mr. Collins," she said one last time, her voice hollow. "If there's any part of you that can hear me, have mercy on my son." But as the seconds ticked by and the silence stretched on, Anne knew that her prayer had fallen on deaf ears. There was no forgiveness to be found here, no redemption. The night had deepened, and the graveyard was now bathed in shadows, the trees casting long, skeletal fingers across the ground. The world felt cold, darker than before, as if the very soul of the place had turned its back on her. So Anne took a shaky breath and turned away from the grave, her heart heavy with despair. She had done all she could. She had begged, pleaded, even offered her own life in exchange for Jack's. But the ghost of Mr. Collins remained silent, unmoved by her grief. As she walked away from the grave, the wind picked up once more, swirling around her like an unseen hand pushing her out of the cemetery. She glanced over her shoulder one last time, hoping, praying for a sign, some flicker of hope that her words had reached beyond the veil of death. But there was nothing, only the cold, unyielding stone of Mr. Collins' grave, standing silent in the darkness. Anne's heart acted with the finality of it all. Jack was beyond her reach now. The spirit that had claimed him would not be swayed by her tears or her promises. The curse that had fallen upon her family could not be undone. It was too late. As she stepped through the cemetery gates and back into the quiet streets, the full weight of her grief crashed over her, threatening to pull her under. The wind howled through the night, carrying with it a sense of finality that sent chills down her spine. She had sought redemption, but there was none to be found. And as she walked the lonely path back to her empty home, the terrible truth settled deep within her soul. Jack was lost. Part 9. A mother's despair. The house felt different when Anne returned. It wasn't just the silence that greeted her, it was something deeper, something darker. The moment she stepped through the door, she could feel it. The air was thick with a presence that seemed to seep from the walls, curling around her like cold, invisible fingers. She stood in the doorway, frozen, as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for her next move. Her heart pounded in her chest, the rhythm sharp and erratic. This wasn't the home she had known. The warmth, the comfort, it was all gone, replaced by an oppressive, stifling atmosphere that choked her with every breath she took. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, deeper, like they were hiding something, or someone. The house had become a tomb. Anne closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing unnervingly through the empty rooms. Her hands trembled as she turned the lock, a futile attempt to keep the outside world at bay. But what haunted her now wasn't something she could keep out with a locked door. It was already inside, within these walls, within her mind, and most terrifying of all, within her heart. The stillness was deafening. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the window seemed amplified in the silence. Anne stood in the middle of the room, her arms wrapped around herself, as if she could shield herself from the cold emptiness that surrounded her. The weight of the house pressed down on her, and her thoughts turned to Jack, her son, her boy lying helpless and motionless in the hospital, his body nothing more than a shell of the person he once was. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought of him, the guilt gnawing at her insides like a relentless, insidious parasite. She had failed him. She had tried to make things right, had begged for forgiveness, but it hadn't mattered. No matter how much she pleaded, no matter how many tears she shed, the ghost of Mr. Collins hadn't listened. He had taken her son from her, and now Jack was lost forever. She moved through the house like a ghost herself, her footsteps light and hesitant. Every room was a reminder of what she had lost, what she could never get back. The kitchen, where she had once prepared meals for Jack when he was just a boy. The living room, where they had spent countless evenings watching television, laughing together. Now, those memories felt distant, like they belonged to another lifetime. She paused in front of Jack's bedroom door, her hand hovering over the doorknob. She hadn't set foot inside since the night it all happened. The night she had found him on the bathroom floor, his wrists slashed, his life slipping away before her eyes. Her stomach twisted at the memory, and for a moment she thought she might be sick. But she had to go in. She had to face it. With a deep breath, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was exactly as Jack had left it, disheveled, chaotic, a reflection of his mind in those last few days. Clothes were scattered across the floor, papers and books strewn across the desk, and the bed was unmade, the sheets twisted in a tangle of fabric. It smelled faintly of him, a mix of cologne and something else, something darker, Fear, despair, she couldn't place it, but it made her skin crawl. Anne stepped inside, her legs trembling beneath her. The room was heavy with the weight of his absence, and she felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing in on her from all sides. She could almost hear him, his voice, frantic and desperate, calling out to her in the middle of the night, begging her to make it stop. "Mom, please, I can't. I can't take it anymore." The memory sent a shiver down her spine, and she clutched at the doorframe for support. Jack had been so terrified, so consumed by the haunting that had driven him to the edge. And she hadn't been able to save him. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, and she sank to her knees in the middle of the room. The weight of it all was too much to bear. The guilt, the loss, the crushing realization that Jack was gone. He was still alive, technically, but the boy she had known, the son she had raised, he was gone. Taken by the vengeful spirit of Mr. Collins, lost in a nightmare from which she could never wake. "I'm so sorry," Anne whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I failed you," the words echoed in the stillness, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the house. Her tears fell freely now, dripping onto the floor as she buried her face in her hands. She had tried everything, every ritual, every prayer, but none of it had worked. The spirit of Mr. Collins had claimed Jack, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. She had lost him. As the sobs racked her body, Anne became acutely aware of the stillness around her. The house had always been quiet, but now it felt different. The silence was unnatural, suffocating. And then, in the midst of her grief, she heard it. Footsteps. Faint at first, barely audible over the sound of her sobbing, but unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, like someone pacing just beyond the room. The floorboards creaked softly, the sound growing louder, closer. Anne froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The footsteps continued, echoing down the hallway, moving toward her with an unsettling purpose. She lifted her head, her tear-streaked face pale as fear tightened its grip on her. "Jack," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was no answer, only the steady, relentless sound of footsteps drawing nearer. Anne's breath hitched in her throat as she struggled to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. She turned toward the door, her pulse racing, and for a moment she thought she saw a shadow pass by in the hallway, a fleeting figure, gone before she could fully register it. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with anticipation. Anne stood frozen in place, her body trembling, as she waited for something, anything to happen. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. Then, from the darkness beyond the doorway, came a voice, and it was a whisper, barely more than a breath, but it chilled her to the bone. The voice was familiar, achingly so. It was Jack's. But it was wrong, distorted, twisted by something dark and malevolent. It wasn't the voice of her son. It couldn't be. Anne's throat tightened with terror, and she backed away from the door, her hands shaking. "Jack," she called out, her voice quivering. "Is that you?" The silence stretched on, unbearable. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps started again, retreating down the hallway, fading into the distance until they disappeared entirely. Anne was left standing in the middle of Jack's room, alone with the echo of her son's voice and the suffocating weight of her grief. Her heart ached, her mind racing with fear and confusion. Was it real? Or had the torment finally driven her mad? The house remained silent, but the oppressive presence lingered, suffusing the air with dread. Anne sank to the floor, her body trembling as the darkness closed in around her. There was no escape, no redemption, only the suffocating grief that weighed on her chest like a stone, and the unbearable truth that her son was gone. And in that moment, Anne understood the awful finality of it all. The haunting would never stop. She would never be free. As the shadows deepened and the night crept in, Anne whispered one final, desperate apology into the darkness. But the only reply was the fading sound of footsteps, leaving her alone, utterly and completely alone with her despair.